Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Hamry over at CSIS, and I have been looking forward to this seminar more than any of you because I know the people that are going to be participating in it, and I know the great insights and the intellect that they bring to these very important questions. The question in front of us, of course, is how does a republic sustain itself? What is the foundation of how we understand our mutual responsibilities to each other to protect and defend and to nurture a political system where we all are involved and we all have a say in creating a better world for our future? And that's really the most powerful topic you can possibly imagine. The purpose of this session is really to give all of our audience a deeper insight into how very senior, very important military leaders have viewed the importance of civic consciousness and civic education in America. I've got some questions that I want to explore with these colleagues, but I will say, when you think about it, we're such a fortunate nation, a democracy that depends on a military establishment that is just profoundly grounded in rule of law. Now, how do we get there? How do we think about that? How do we understand that? That's what we're going to explore today. And I'm so grateful for these colleagues that are joining us today. Suzanne, why don't you get us started? Frame the day, and I look forward to being a part of it.
Great. Dr. Hamry, thank you so much. And as always, thank you for your long-standing, strong support for this project and these efforts. Today's program is part of our ongoing strategic dialogue on civics education as a national security imperative. And the project is made possible through generous funding from Craig Newmark, for which we are so grateful. It initially grew out of the work that we were doing under the Defending Democratic Institutions project to understand and counter disinformation, information operations from our adversaries, particularly Kremlin efforts to undermine public trust in democracy and its institutions. And with insights from many, including our friend and colleague Heather Conley, author of the Kremlin Playbook, we really began to understand that one of the most effective and sustainable ways to counter this pernicious messaging that we were seeing in 2017, 2018, 2016, and ultimately really long before that, is to build public resilience. And key to that resilience is a solid understanding of what democracy is all about, why it's important, why is it worth fighting for, that it must be fought for because it is under attack, and that it's worth fighting for not because it's perfect, but because it's susceptible to change. And each of us must be empowered to hold our institutions accountable and to be more effective agents of change. So this past summer, we kicked off this series with a two-part conversation about systemic racism as a national security issue and how a broader and more reinvigorated civic education could address that national security challenge of systemic racism. Future programs are going to bring in national security practitioners from the intelligence community. We'll hear from the bench and the bar, from judges and lawyers, including national security lawyers. We're going to talk to folks in technology and in the media, as well as members of Congress, all to flesh out and really understand this national security perspective on the need for reinvigorating civics education. So today we get the view, as Dr. Hamry said, from three outstanding retired military leaders. We could not have asked for a better panel. We are so grateful. Three very busy people. General Carter Ham is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of the United States Army. He's a member of a very small group of Army senior leaders who rose from private to four-star general, exercising leadership roles at every level, including leading the Big Red One. General Ham served as an enlisted infantryman in the 82nd Airborne Division, subsequently graduating in 1976 from John Carroll University as a distinguished military graduate. His extensive service has taken him to Italy, Germany, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Macedonia, Qatar, Iraq, and uniquely among the Army's leaders to over 40 African countries, in addition to a number of assignments within the United States. General Ham retired in June of 2013 after nearly 38 years of service. Admiral William H. McRaven is currently Chancellor of the University of Texas System. He's a retired U.S. Navy four-star admiral. As Chancellor, he leads one of the nation's largest and most respected institutions of higher education. He oversees 14 institutions that educate 221,000 students. Prior to becoming Chancellor, Admiral McRaven was the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, where he led a force of 69,000 men and women and was responsible for conducting counterterrorism operations worldwide. He's a recognized national authority on U.S. foreign policy. He's advised presidents on both sides of the aisle, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and other leaders on defense issues. And he is the author of Special Ops, Case Studies in Special Operations Warfare, Theory, and Practice. He's received numerous national and international awards and recognition. Most recently, in 2015, the Intrepid Sea and Air Space Museum selected him to receive the Intrepid Freedom Award for his distinguished service in promoting and defending the values of democracy. General Lori Robinson is a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution, as well as at the Belfer Center up at Harvard University. After 37 years of military service, General Robinson retired in 2018 as commander of the United States Northern Command, U.S. NORTHCOM, and North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. She is the first woman in U.S. history to lead a combatant command. Prior to her assignment as commander of U.S. NORTHCOM, she commanded Pacific Air Forces and was Air Component Commander for the U.S. Pacific Command at Joint Base Pearl Harbor in Hickam, Hawaii. She entered the Air Force in 1982 through the ROTC program at the University of New Hampshire. She served in a variety of positions as an air battle manager, including instructor and commander of the Command and Control Operations Division at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School, chief of tactics in the 965th Airborne Warning and Control Squadron, and she deployed as vice commander of the 405th Expeditionary Wing, leading more than 2,000 airmen in operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. She also served in senior roles at the Pentagon and with the Joint Staff as Deputy Commander of U.S. Air Force's Central Command, Deputy Commander of the Combined Force Air Component with U.S. Central Command in Southwest Asia, and Vice Commander of the Air Combat Command at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. So we are, as you can see, incredibly fortunate to have these outstanding leaders from the military here to talk about. We want to hit really two areas: the importance of civics education for the general public, that the general public have a solid grounding in these fundamental concepts, why they see that from their perspective as military commanders particularly important for national security, and then also why it's important that the men and women coming into the military have that solid grounding and foundation. And Admiral McRaven, I want to start with you. You have been very eloquent, gave a commencement speech a few years ago, which you talked in a very forceful and passionate way about how important general K through 12 education is, right, for national security. And it's one of the things that I know you have focused on as in your role as chancellor, even in higher education, how you can collaborate with that K through 12. So talk to us a little bit about both, that importance of general education, but then how does that fit in specifically with the importance of civics education for K through 12.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Great to be here with you all. And John Hamre, always great to spend time with you and CSIS. I will make one correction. I have stepped down as the Chancellor of the University of Texas System. However, I am still teaching at the LBJ School of Public Affairs there, a graduate class. So I think I can still field most of these questions. So let me talk about kind of K through 12. Within the state of Texas, and I grew up here in Texas, came back here when I retired. And, there is at every elementary level, there is always some engagement in civics, recognizing that civics for, the average citizen is not only about your rights as a citizen, but your duties as a citizen. And I think sometimes we forget this idea that we have duties as citizens as well, and really impressing upon the citizenry how important it is to vote. To talk to your representatives, to peacefully protest when you disagree with something. Understanding these fundamentals has got to begin in K through 12. Now, where it begins, I would leave that up to the Department of Education, the educators to understand where is the right place to start. But I will offer, when I grew up, and my father was a World War II fighter pilot, part of this greatest generation. My mother was an elementary school teacher from East Texas. And so they instilled in me this sense of ethics and national service very early on. But when it comes to, when I start thinking about the linkage between kind of the role of the military and the civic responsibility, I actually go back to something my father talked to me about when I was probably a teenager. And it was about Truman's decision to fire MacArthur. And I remember thinking to myself as Dad started this, and it wasn't like it was a lecture, it was more just a conversation. And I thought, well, my father, obviously having been an Air Force, Army Air Corps to start with, Air Force officer, that he clearly would have sided with MacArthur. But it was just the opposite. My father impressed upon me the role of civilian leadership over the military. And he, every opportunity he could, he would bring up the story of MacArthur and Truman and how MacArthur overstepped his bounds and Truman had to fire him. And we as military officers need to understand why that is so very, very important. Again, in a republic, in a democracy, civilian control of the military and the value of that. So, you can start and teach things in the classroom, but I think most young men and women are going to learn more when their parents reinforce these values to them.
Great. And General Ham, I know this is an issue that civil military relations is an issue that you spend a lot of time thinking about and particularly in your current role. The association that you lead is as part of its mission to educate the public about the importance of the role of the Army in our national security. And as you do that, how does the awareness of the American public about these foundational issues, and including the role of the military in our society, impact your ability to do that, to play that role?
Thanks, Suzanne and Dr. Hamre, and I'm honored to be here with John Robinson and Admiral McCraven. Like Admiral McCraven, my dad was a World War II veteran. He was a naval officer and served in a PT squadron in the South Pacific. But unlike Bill's dad, my dad didn't talk about the military as we were growing up. We knew he'd been in the Navy. There was an old uniform hanging in the closet, and it kind of kept one picture. But frankly, it wasn't until I was a major, attending the Naval Staff College in Newport, where he had met my mother many years ago during the war after he was wounded. And he was walking with our kids, and that something triggered in him, and he started talking to our kids about his military service. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, what the hell did you never tell me that? It was an interesting discussion. But there was something, I think, in that generation of truly the greatest generation. There was this ethos of service. My dad talked about that. in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, they just all went to serve. I mean, all the young men of his era, they just went to serve because that's, as Bill said, they felt that duty, that responsibility. And I think that was instilled in me from an early age. And though we didn't talk much about my dad's military service, we did talk about service in a larger sense. And to Bill's point, that you have responsibilities that come along with the privileges of being an American citizen. And there's lots of different ways to fulfill those responsibilities. So I think Bill's right. It's kind of started at home with that kernel of you have responsibilities. You should seek to serve others, however you may choose to do that. But serving others was a central theme. In the scholastic sense, not that I find myself not being much of a scholar, but you in those days, from junior high school through high school, these were mandated courses. I mean, you had to take courses, and I grew up mostly in Ohio, so you had to take a course in Ohio history, and you had to take a course in in American history and in world history and government, and so it was part of the mandated curriculum going through school. So it wasn't by choice, not by preference. It was just that's what was required, so that's what you did it. But in that process, you get exposed to these principles and to these ideas. And I do worry a bit that in many school systems, those kinds of courses are falling by the wayside. I would put physical education in that category as well. But I think that's a challenge because it's not central, I think, to the education of young people. And again, I would agree. I'd defer to Bill. Though being married to a lifelong educator, she has a better idea of where that entry point should be. But I do fear that there's a kind of a loss of general knowledge. And as I travel about in my role here at the Association of the United States Army, obviously not traveling these days, but you do have these conversations, and particularly with young people. And what I find is that young people are eager to learn, but they don't have the same basis of knowledge. And so the challenge, I think, for us as a nation is how do we make sure that the rising cohort of young people have means to satisfy their thirst for knowledge. They want to know about their government. It is their government. It is our government, right? It's not somebody else's job. It's our job. And they want to be part of that. But I fear that the paths to getting the information necessary are not as wide open as they probably ought to be.
Yeah, so we, as we've been working on this issue, the statistics are disheartening. So everyone has seen the survey results about how many Americans don't know how many branches of government there are and what the three branches are. But when you look at resources, at least some of the work indicates that there are roughly $54 per student spent on STEM education and a nickel per student spent on civics and history education. So General Robinson, as the commander of NORTHCOM, particularly, I think, thinking every day about the role of the military inside the United States, how does the decline in civics education and civic knowledge in the general population, how did that impact the way you thought about your role there? And ultimately, potentially, our national security.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. And I'm humbled to be sitting in Hollywood Squares with General Ham and Admiral McCraven and Dr. Hamre. So thank you so much. First of all, I would like to piggyback on what General Ham and Admiral McCraven said, and then it'll lead into the answer. I had a pilot for a father in the Air Force, right? And so here we all had military families, but I would tell you what I learned, and I learned it was from my grandmother. She was a member of the state legislature in the state of New Hampshire. And I learned how to carry a sign in her front yard, and she had a specific person she wanted for president, and all the grandchildren were out there marching in circles, raising our signs. She was very upset that they were going to raise the drinking age in the state of New Hampshire from 18 to 21. And she was like, you can vote, they can draft you, but you can't drink. Lori, you need to come down and protest. So I was like, okay, Grandma. So I went down to the Capitol and sat up in the balcony and did my protesting, peaceful protesting. And lo and behold, the next day I'm on the front page of the Manchester Union. And my grandmother was so proud. And she sent it to my father, who was living in Germany at the time. And he was like, Lori, what did you do? And I said, hey, Grandma said. But for me, that was learning, right? I could have read everything, but that was learning. And so now when you transition and you deal with governors and adjutant generals of each of the states, you deal with population, from the ground all the way to National Command Authority. And so it's the ability of you to not just talk about it, but also demonstrate it. So as an example, one of the exercises we had was about that whole relationship, civil-military relationship, and it was called Art and Century. And, we would have, I think I'd been the commander for 2 weeks, and I walked into the room and there were like 250 people there. And I was like, who are all these people? Well, as we went through it, I realized it was people from the local level that this exercise was going to take place, to the state level, to other military entities, some of my subordinate commanders. And so through that teaching and through that exercising, you learn more and more about what your role inside the homeland is, and how you partner with governors and the folks in all the way down to the local level, and the importance that is, that yes, that uniform is just amazing, but the importance that we are here to support, right? Whether it was hurricanes or wildfires and all of that, our job is to provide that unique capability, defense support to civil authorities. But it's that doing that, for me, I learned, and it was doing that was able to use an exercise or use things that were tangible, that you can explain that in the role of the military inside the homeland.
Yeah, so that certain level of transparency there, right? It can be important. And Admiral McCraven, it's a challenge in the context of special operations, where you were, so much of that activity is clandestine, right? It's covert activity. And I've always, and Dr. Hamry and I have talked about this, thought a lot about how uncomfortably intelligence activities, which is where I spent much of my career, reside in a democracy with its demands for transparency and openness, and the intelligence community's demands for secrecy. And I think it makes it a particular challenge for sustaining public support for the kinds of things that we have to do to protect our national security. How might having a better understanding of how these parts of our democracy work and the ways in which we have built accountability in, even if the public can't know all the details, how does that impact our national security in terms of the public support for the steps that may need to be taken?
Well, Suzanne, I'll get back to the discussion we had on rights and duties. And so, if you are a citizen of this country and you want to know what the U.S. Special Operations Command is doing, other than those things that are clandestine or covert, all you have to do is listen to somebody testify, talk to your representative, go in and spend time with the House Armed Services committees, and you will find the transparency is laid out there. We have to lay out our budget in great detail. So the transparency of the budget, of course, becomes the transparency to some degrees of the operations. Then you have to rely on your elected representatives. So if we are briefing a secret mission, something that should not be made public for fear of compromising sources and methods or potential operations, then that's where the duly elected representatives provide oversight for the country. And of course, you know, coming from the intelligence community, you have the select intelligence committees that provide all the oversight for the CIA and the NSA on the covert operations. So to your point, yes, the general public may not be aware of clandestine or covert operations in order, again, to protect sources and methods, but also to protect the operators on the ground as well. But their duly elected representatives do know about these operations. And so, you know, there's always that opportunity to ensure that you are electing the right people to these committees and to the legislatures. I will offer one interesting vignette. I was in Crystal City in Washington, D.C., getting ready to go testify my second day of testimony on something. And I went in to get breakfast at one of the quick stop breakfast places. And there was an elderly couple in there. Guy must have been, you know, in his late 70s, maybe early 80s. And I'm with my guys, and he comes up to me and he says, "Aren't you Admiral McRaven? Didn't I see you on TV yesterday?" And I'm thinking to myself, what is he talking about? He had been watching C-SPAN. And of course, I was thinking to myself, who in the world watches C-SPAN? Well, the answer is a lot of people watch C-SPAN. And of course, he'd been following the budget. And he sat down with me for about 15 minutes, and we talked about why I was doing certain things to the budget. I was stunned by this and impressed. One, that somebody was so engaged in the public discourse in understanding what was happening, back to he had a duty, a responsibility as a citizen to understand what's going on in his country. And there are ways to do that that can still protect the covert and clandestineness of the operations and yet still provide the transparency that's necessary.
Yeah,
Suzanne,
absolutely.
could I jump in there for a minute?
Please,
So
please.
I absolutely agree with what Admiral McRaven said in terms of the civilian oversight of all these activities that General Robinson, Admiral McRaven, and I were involved in while we were in service, and that is very important. And that elected civilian oversight is hugely important. But the civilian oversight also has another job, which is, I think, equally important. And that is the approval, with the consent of the Senate, the elected representatives of the nation, for the appointment of Admiral McRaven to serve in that position, for General Robinson to serve in that position. People who senior military officials who shoulder the responsibility in very real ways, very tangible ways, for life and death. And the process, the scrutiny that those commanders undergo to be considered for, nominated, and then confirmed by the Senate to serve in those positions is extraordinary. Unlike any other nation that I know of, where senior military officials go through that level of scrutiny. That's another way, I think, to demonstrate that, in fact, those senior commanders are very much accountable for their actions, and they are accountable through the elected representatives to the nation. And that should give people great comfort that this process is quite rigorous. They don't always get it right. I mean, they made me a 4-star. My kids would tell you that was a little crazy, but the process is designed to do just what Admiral McRaven talked about, to ensure that there is accountability to the citizenry.
But if I can, I'm sorry, but if I can dovetail off that, because to Carter's point, it should give the citizens great confidence, but it should also make them very uncomfortable when people are sitting in positions for which they have not been confirmed by the Senate. So when you have acting secretaries and acting undersecretaries and acting assistant secretaries, that does not serve the American public well.
Yeah, so the accountability that is designed in the system doesn't always work as designed, right? The Congress doesn't always do its oversight and exercise its accountability in the way that we might hope. Sometimes executive branch accountability mechanisms don't always work and can be frustrated. So what becomes even more important that the American public understand how they are meant to work and how to hold them accountable for holding you accountable, right? And so that, I think that's one of the reasons. And so General Robinson, I know you were so gracious over the last several months to share your insights and help guide some of our work on looking at the role of federal forces inside the United States, particularly around elections. And there too, I think my sense is that how important it is for the American public to understand what their expectations should be in order to hold our military accountable and our leaders accountable for using it appropriately. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. And it not just to hold them to be accountable, especially when you're talking inside the continental United States, but knowing what they can and cannot do. What from an authority perspective, from a roles and missions perspective, what specifically active duty people can and cannot do, which was what my role brought in. So not just holding them accountable, but not asking them to do things that go against the authorities that they have, specifically posse comitatus.
Yeah. So Dr. Hamre, I'm going to turn it over to you. And
well, thank you, Susan. I do have a question I would love to pose to the three of you. I must confess, I remember my civics education classes when I was in high school. It was about as exciting as getting that lecture from your dentist about flossing your teeth. It was really boring, and flossing efficiency and all that. Gosh, I hated it. But I do. So let's make this a bit more vivid, if we might, because each of you has had command responsibilities, over forces that could produce significant violence if necessary. Now, this is a real challenge for a democracy because democracies depend on open, transparent activities, but military organizations by definition are authoritarian, chain of command, they're rule-based, they live with secrecy, there's an environment of classification, and they got guns. Okay, now this is a real issue for a democracy. How does a democracy manage to control forces that are authoritarian, efficient, and potentially violent? And it seems to me that this is the core question about civics and civics education. How do you discuss with subordinates rule of law?
So I'll take a first swing at it, and I think Dr. Hamre, I think it starts with history and tradition. To remember that the first people in our land to carry guns, to carry arms, were citizens first. They were the militia. Long before the establishment of an army or a navy, there was the militia that came from the citizenry. They were farmers. They were shopkeepers first and foremost, and they took up arms hesitatingly and only when required. And I think that tradition was sound then. I think it is still sound now. We are not a militaristic people, thank heavens, and I think that tradition I think remains strong. Secondly, as I would often talk, particularly with officer candidates or young officers, our service is anchored in the oath that we take, and it is in that oath where you get the essence of service. And General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has spoken often about this, about not an oath to a king or a queen or any other entity, but an oath to an idea a set of ideas encapsulated in the Constitution. And I think the more that we ensure that those who serve, that their service is anchored in that oath, then I think we will be sound. So I think there's an education part within the military to make sure that when one raises one's right hand and swears that oath, to think about that and embody the principles that are established in that oath. And I think that helps keep the military anchored in the true values of the nation.
Yeah, I'd like to pile on what General Ham said. I know every single time I had the privilege to do a promotion ceremony and we would do the oath, I would sit and say exactly what he just said, not just say, let's take the oath, but let's talk about why we do this and why we raise our right hand and swear to the Constitution, to support and defend the Constitution. And I think that education helps people understand. The other part I would say too, sure, we have guns and bombs and bullets and all that stuff. We only use those to defend the nation or our national interests. And so in doing that, we make sure everybody understands that it's not us, the military, going just to do something because it felt good or it seemed like the thing to do. It's because it's in our national security interests. And that helps in the education part of it.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything Carter and Lori have said in terms of the oath and the allegiance to the Constitution. I'd add a couple more things, kind of to Lori's point here. We, the military, don't decide to go off to war. It is the elected civilians, leaders, that tell us where to go when we go off to war. So when you talk about, John, when you talk about accountability, how is the military held accountable? It's held accountable by the people of the country through their elected officials. That's one way. The other way really is through the press. And this is why, candidly, when the president called the press the enemy of the American people, I was the chancellor of the University of Texas at the time. And I said that statement alone was the greatest threat to democracy in my lifetime. And I stand by those words. Because when the president of the United States, who also raises his hand and supports the Constitution of the United States, begins to undermine the First Amendment of the Constitution, which really is responsible for holding us accountable, the press has a responsibility to hold the elected leaders accountable, to hold the military accountable. When you begin to undermine that, you begin to undermine what is really part and parcel to our democracy. And then I would add one more thing, and Carter touched on it, this idea of our tradition. Within the SEAL community, we have had a lot of bad behavior here over the last couple of years that has come to light. Again, come to light through the press. So you need the press to kind of continually be on you. But what our responsibility was to take those lessons of bad behavior and show the young men in particular that are coming up through the SEAL ranks that this is not how you behave on the battlefield. And you have to continue to reinforce good behavior, particularly when you are on a battlefield where the fighting is close in, where it can get brutal, where it can get caustic, where it really weighs upon the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that are out there fighting it. If you as a leader don't spend your time making sure that they stay on the right path by reinforcing good behavior, then you will find bad behavior coming.
Can I follow up with the three of you on exactly this point, Bill? And I'm very glad that you raised it. And just to dig a little deeper, every military operation kind of starts with a formulation of the ground rules. We call rules of engagement. What are the ground rules that we're going to operate with when we send forces into a theater? Now, these are young kids. 18-year-old kids, we give them a gun, they're full of energy, but we need to control that. We need to know that they're going to operate in a lawful way. And we do that through something called rules of engagement. Now, this isn't just your authority over them, it is the responsibility in a democracy. Could you describe how you thought about rules of engagement when you were in operations?
Yeah, I will tell you, we thought about rules of engagement almost every minute of every day. And not only rules of engagement, but the law of armed conflict. Every time you're getting ready to go do an operation, the law of armed conflict is really what frames your ability to maneuver within that space. And then the rules of engagement further define that. But here's what I'd offer to you, to John and to your listeners. And nobody, I think, knows this better, frankly, than both Carter and Lori. From the standpoint of the rules of engagement, those are all well and good. But if you are not, as a leader, getting down with your airmen, with your Marines, with your sailors, with your soldiers, and watching them on the battlefield, Suzanne, when she introduced Carter, talked about the fact that he visited 40 countries in Africa. Well, my guess is he visited those 40 countries, met with the soldiers that were there. Lori does that when she does her battlefield engagement and maneuver around. You have to do that to make sure that the young men and women are following the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement might be great to throw out there, but if you as a leader sit back in your office and are just sitting there drinking coffee and think that the troops are going to follow the rules of engagement because you told them, you will be mistaken and you will be proven wrong very quickly. You have got to get down and reinforce good behavior.
John, I had the privilege of serving as the director for operations on the joint staff, the J3. And so part of that job description is that staff is the staff that puts together the operations orders that directs, with the Secretary of Defense's direction, the employment of military forces. And of course, included in that are the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are most often crafted by lawyers, for lawyers, for review by lawyers. And what we would always try to do is to say, okay, that's nice and that's interesting, but the rules of engagement are applied by a staff sergeant or by a first lieutenant in the cockpit of a combat aircraft, or by a Navy lieutenant manning the station, a weapons station on a naval platform. And so we tried always very hard to say, okay, how do you distill the rules of engagement so that they accurately control the application of violence, the military force that Dr. Hammer, that you talk about, but convey it in a way that is understandable and applicable by someone who is under duress, probably tired, probably being shot at by somebody else. How does the person in that situation make sure that they make the right decision on the application of force? That's not an easy thing to do. And as Bill and Lori have articulated, this constant hammering, constant talking, exercising, rehearsals, drills, and the like, but it boils down to accountability. An accountability of American forces, unlike accountability in just about any other military force that I ever engaged with.
Yeah, I was going to talk what Carter just talked about at the end, and that's training. I mean, the importance of training. Are you going to know the specific rules of engagement for an operation that may be coming up? You might not know all of them, but you'll know lots of them. And so that ability to train, when I was the group commander and wing commander at Tinker Air Force Base for AWACS, and send folks overseas all the time, I would go down to the simulators and sit with them, as they would be practicing, getting ready to go overseas, and listening to what they're saying and what they're doing, and making sure it was in accordance with the rules of engagement. It was in accordance to the special instructions, and it was, inside the law of armed conflict. And on top of that, as crews would leave, standing up in front of them before they depart and telling them, they've been practicing for this, they've been doing this, and they are ready to go, and letting them know that, not I've been watching, not to watch, but to make sure they were ready to go. And that to me is so important too, as a commander, to stand up and let them know that that they are ready, and you've been watching them.
Well, thank you, all three of you. And the reason I bring it up is to say, I mean, civics education is not the kind of the boring, remember who was the third governor of Ohio, you know? It's about the foundation of how we operate as a modern, sophisticated society subject to our democratic principles. And nobody does this as well as the military does. You talk about it all the time. You focus on it. You have classes. I think every newly commissioned officer, one of his first courses is about the law of war. I mean, this is crucial, and Americans don't understand it, how vital the civics education is, because it informs how we have a modern society and a modern military and the gold standard of militaries that protect democratic values. Back to you, Suzanne. I'm sorry. I feel better. I got that off my chest.
So John, and Lori and Bill both have this same experience. You know, we've each had the privilege of engaging for many, many years with the militaries of other nations. And many of them are great, our closest allies and partners, to be sure. Some of them aren't so great. In my last assignment working in Africa, this idea of accountability, this idea of being subject to the rule of law, the idea of serving in the military as service to others rather than a position of privilege was challenging for us. And the example, you know, frankly, not of admirals and generals, but the example of sergeants and you know, lieutenants and young officers in those other militaries is incredibly powerful. And I think in this era of the, you know, the more readily transferable information and YouTube and all the rest of that example that young American service members spread across the globe is one of the greatest means of education we could ever hope to have.
No.
Yeah, General, you know, picking up on that and what you were able to see firsthand when you were serving in all of these countries, you know, that's the statistics that that concern me the most really are around the declining trust in and appreciation for democracy. I mean, you know, recent survey that asked about the importance of democracy to American society, only 39% of young adults aged 29 and under said it was absolutely important. And I think one of the things that a solid civics education can teach is, again, as I say, not that democracy is perfect, but that it is susceptible to change, unlike authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, and the role of individuals in holding it accountable and moving us to that more perfect union. But understanding, looking at democracy in contrast to what forms of government in other countries, I think is a big part of that sort of comparative analysis. And so, General, you know, again, your perspective, having seen the forms of governance elsewhere, you know, what would you say to the American public about, you know, the value of democracy?
Yeah, so it's that great Churchill statement, right? The worst possible form of government, except for all the others, right? You know, I mean, it's ugly and it's messy and it's untidy and all the rest of that. But for those of us who have had the opportunity to live in, serve in, and observe other forms of government, we're unmatched in that regard. And I think that's part of it, Suzanne, is that many Americans, not having had that experience, don't really recognize what the alternatives are. Once you see that, you know, I remember as a young brigadier general serving in Iraq the first time in Mosul, and the fledgling Iraqi police had a particularly poor performance in one particular operation. As I was really kind of getting after the commander and of the provincial governor. And the provincial governor pulls me aside and he says, listen, he says, I know that in America, you guys trust your police. You know, you tell your kids, if you ever get lost, if you ever feel you are in trouble, you go find a policeman and that policeman will take care of you. And the provincial governor says to me, he says, no Iraqi parent would ever tell their children to do that. It's one of these, you know, one of these blinding flashes of the obvious of recognizing how fortunate we are, how privileged we are to have this cherished democracy that is ours. And I just think that many Americans just don't understand what the alternatives are. And if they saw them up close, as the three of us have, you'd be thanking your lucky stars every day to be in this great country.
Every day.
And of course, there are communities in our own country that sometimes don't feel comfortable necessarily calling on law enforcement in their community. And it gets back to this idea of, you know, that we have to bring, and in those instances, we have to be able to hold institutions accountable and bring about change and counter the pernicious messaging that would call on us to despair and give up because our institutions are irrevocably broken. And so we've got some audience questions. And on that point, one of the questions is, what do you see as the potential risks that social media and digital technology pose, among other things, to the formation of a civic identity that is consistent with this ethic of military service that you've been talking about? And I know that generally the military is increasingly concerned that their members are targeted for disinformation. And again, my sense is that certainly Russia's disinformation is designed to get people to give up on our democracy and our institutions. So how is the military thinking about how to deal with that? Any of you? General Robinson?
So I'm going to kind of take it a little different. I will tell you, social media is something that, as a young one, obviously, since I'm old, we didn't have it, you know, when I was younger. But as I became higher in the Air Force and the military, especially when I became a commander, social media was really starting to be prolific. And in a very simple example, you know, if you had something happen on your installation, and I had a horrible tragedy happen when I was a commander once, and what's hard about that is that it gets out on social media before you're ready to either call a family member or you know, have to deal with it, whatever the situation is. I will tell you that I always was concerned about social media from the perspective of people posting where they were, especially if they were deployed. That was quite dangerous, and not just the member, but spouses also. And so you know, often I would talk about that as folks were deploying, and talk to the spouses and families about it too. So it has added a dimension. You know I didn't have to deal with very much growing up, but I dealt with later. And, you know, and then you add on to that this notion of disinformation, and that we believe things sometimes more in social media than we do from credible organizations such as CSIS. And so I think, you know, how do you make sure that the information that's out there is accurate? You know, that's for other people to figure out. I just know, living with the parts of it that were hard for me as a commander, but has gotten more and more over time.
Yeah, and a big part of that media literacy, and a fundamental attribute of effective civic education and history education, all kinds of education, is teaching critical thinking skills, right? Admiral McCraven, how does the military, we've got a question from our audience about this, how does the military make sure to incorporate this kind of training, critical thinking training, into the curriculum?
Yeah, Suzanne, I'll answer that question, but let me go back to the previous one real quickly, because as long as there have been militaries, there have been rumors. And, we used to have the term rumor control, everybody knows who's ever been a commander or down to the lowest level, rumors can run like wildfire through a military organization. So there has got to be some sort of trusted mechanism through which the rank and file can get the right information. So as we have to deal with social media, recognizing that, everything from, when is the ship pulling out, to when are we marching, to when is the operation going on, to what happened to an operation that went south, there has got to be a mechanism within the organizations to put out the facts as we know them as quickly as we can. I think that's what all the commanders are dealing with. On the critical thinking side, I'm often asked from my time as a Navy SEAL, what was the one attribute that we were looking for in our Navy SEALs? And people always thought it would be something like, well, can they run a 4-minute mile? Can they run a 2:30 marathon? How many pull-ups and push-ups can they do? And nothing could be further from the truth. You are looking for an individual that can think on their feet, think for themselves, be critical thinkers when there is so much information coming in that they've got to be able to parse through what the right information is and what the wrong information is, and make the right decision at the right time to take care of the troops. This is about critical thinking. So while going through Navy SEAL training is predominantly physical, there is another year or year and a half after that where we have an opportunity to observe and put them in very difficult situations where they have to think through complex problems and make the right decision. And that's how we pick our leaders, based on their ability to, again, respond under pressure, to think critically in difficult times. So some of this is a little bit of Darwinianism in terms of you promote to the top based on your ability to think on your feet and to do so at critical times. Do we teach it? You bet we do. We teach it, back to Lori's point about training, and more training. And you can teach people to think based on various scenarios. But you bet, critical thinking, one of the key talents and qualities you need in great officers and NCOs.
Yeah. And that ability to think on your feet and respond and adapt to changing environment and circumstances, if it isn't grounded in that sense of democratic values and those shared values and fundamental principles, we're not going to achieve the results that we're looking for, I assume. So another indication of the importance of that civic education. So we do have a member of the audience who expressed surprise that national security and civic education haven't always gone hand in hand. What prevents those two disciplines from working more closely together, and what can bridge the two disciplines better? I think it's a good way to kind of bring our conversation to a close, to ask each of you how we can further this goal of bringing the national security community to this effort to reinvigorate civics education in our country. And General Ham, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think it's a really, really important question. And I think it begins, from my perspective, with this understanding that, that the Army, because that's the service that I know the best, it's not my Army. It's not the Army's Army. It's America's Army. It is accountable to the people of America. And in order to exercise their responsibilities, they got to know a little bit about it. And that extends, obviously, across the services to all of the military. So there is, I think, a bit of investment on the part of the citizenry that is required to make the effort to as Emma McCraven has spoken, to learn, to read, to listen, to gather information, to engage with to engage in the debate, to participate in the election process, and make your interests known to your elected officials. I think that is really important. And I think for me, as I thought about this session today, that I will tell you the image that when you think about this intersection of civics and military service, to me, what resonated was President Roosevelt's 1941 speech about the four freedoms, and Norman Rockwell's iconic, image of the four freedoms. If Americans would read that speech, listen to President Roosevelt's speech, freeze in your mind the image of Norman Rockwell's great painting of the four freedoms. Say that's what we're striving for. The sad fact is that it does take a military these days to preserve those four freedoms for Americans, given the threats that we face. But again, it boils down to me that in our uniquely American form of democracy, and Suzanne, you said this, in order to create a more perfect union, not a perfect union, we don't pretend to be perfect, but we do strive to be more perfect each and every day. And that requires each and every one of us to be active participants in that process.
Excellent. General Robinson.
So I would pile right on that. Not only to be active participants, but talk about it all the time. I know all of us go out and do speeches, and I know every single time I will always end up with, I do what I did, so you can do what you do, because our nation needs you to do what you do. And the importance of that civic duty, of whatever you want to do to participate in this very messy democracy, but to create that more perfect union. And so not only demonstrate it, but talk about it, and then teach it in every opportunity that you get.
Great. Admiral McCraven, you get the last word.
Oh, thanks. When I left the service in 2014 and I came back to run the University of Texas system, I'd been gone from Texas for almost 40 years. And what was inspiring to me and a little surprising, I always assumed that it was Washington, D.C. that really made things run in the nation. And imagine my surprise when I came back to Texas and found out that the nation really runs on the great civic leaders that are in our towns, our cities, our states. I watched principals, independent school district folks, councilmen and women, mayors. They are what make this country go. And I was also pleasantly surprised by their interest in national security. Lori talked about doing speeches. Well, as the chancellor, I was always doing speeches. And I would do these town halls with people in small towns like New Braunfels, Texas, that were very, very steeped in national security. They wanted to understand things. They wanted to talk to me about all the things we'd done. So, I go back to Lori's first discussion about being with her grandmother. Exactly right. And Carter's discussion about his father. I mean, this is where we all learn about our civic responsibility. It starts at the local level. It starts in the elementary schools and the junior high schools and the high schools and the towns and the villages. And watching this democratic process work is what will make us all better citizens if we not only watch it, but engage in it. And frankly, it will make our national security that much stronger, because we will have an educated population, an educated citizenry that cares about national security and will point us in the right direction.
Excellent. A great way to end. Dr. Hamry?
No, that was a perfect benediction. I mean, it really sums what we hope everybody in America understands. This is a very, very important responsibility as citizens for us to be knowledgeable of and committed to a stronger, better, more perfect union, as you said, Carter. And no one does that more importantly than our military. It is a foundational value in our military. Civics education, civics consciousness is fundamental, and I see it every day. I'm so grateful for all three of you. Thank you for doing this. Suzanne, let me back to you.
Yep, let me add my thanks. Really very much appreciated. Great conversation, great discussion. And my father, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, killed in Vietnam in 1966, and my mother, who was a corporal and then worked on the Hill, would have loved this. Both of them would have loved this conversation, and your very personal and passionate commitment, not just to public service, but to doing everything you can to strengthen our democracy. So I just echo Dr. Hamry's thanks, and am so grateful.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, John, Carter, Lori. Take
Great to see you.
Splendid session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.